So I was watching all the videos of Kristof Dedene about how to make skies and rocks. That's Kristof Dedene. I liked the method that he had for making rocks. Mostly I've changed my workflow to include vertex colors, but I liked the way he textured them and the way he gave them irregular shapes whenever he would move them around. Also liked what he was doing with clouds. You move clouds around, they change their shape. It looks pretty cool. The trees, though, the workflow felt too convoluted, too much textures or something going on there. So I decided to basically take his methods for making rocks and clouds and change them up a little bit to make trees as well. So that's what this looks like. Let's take a look at one single tree here, and we will figure out what's happening. So the tree itself is, or the tree with the leaves itself, if you edit it, it just started out its life as an icosphere that I subdivided twice, and then just moved some vertexes around with proportional editing on to give them a little bit of an irregular shape. You don't want to make this too distinct of a shape, because if you do, then when you start repeating it, it'll start looking like the same tree being repeated many times. You want a little bit of irregularity here, but not much. Most of the irregularity you want to come from the displacement modifier, which we'll talk about here right now. So there's two modifiers on it. There's a solidify and a displacement. I'll talk about them in reverse order. I'll start with the displacement. So the displacement uses a texture here, and that texture is a Voronoi. And so if you click on that texture tab for the displacement modifier and add a Voronoi texture with these parameters, that is distance squared, 2.5, size 0.2, knob load 0.03, intensity 0.4, and then the feature weights, 1, negative 4.2, 0.37, and 0.321. If you do all that, you'll get a texture that looks like this. And then if you apply that texture to the tree, or to the tree leaves geometry, then you'll get the leaves offset like this. And as you move it around, because I say texture coordinates global here, then as I move it around, the tree changes its shape a bit. That is important. So if you take that tree and duplicate it, move it over here, then each tree will look a little bit different, although as a general rule, it looks the same. You can add then a little extra variation by, say, sizing it a bit, like maybe you size it on its z-axis or something. So here, if I want to make it fatter, you can do that. Make it thinner, you can do that. You can kind of decide how you want that thing to look using some scaling, right? So then if you want the tree leaves to be more jagged, then you scale it up in object mode. And what will happen is, as you scale it, that displacement will get more and more, because that's based on the scale of the object itself. If you want to change the size of the tree leaves area without changing the jaggedness, then what you do is you get into edit mode, select all the vertexes, scale it, and then get back out. And it's still the same amount of jaggediness, but a smaller thing if you do that. I'm going to leave it like that because I've got this duplicated many times. If I change this tree too much, all my other trees will change. So that's the leaf bit, or at least as far as the displacement modifier goes. The other is a solidify modifier. Let's take this away so you can see what goes on. So if you look at this a little bit up close, you can see it's just a hollow shell with leaves all the way around this side. If I add a displacement modifier and have it going thickness 0.3 and the inner direction, then what will end up happening is you just have two layers here, which helps a little bit. Your eye is less able to determine that that's just four layers between you and the other side of the world, right? So there's one here, one right behind it, and on the other side of the tree, two layers as well. That adds enough, for my eye, it adds enough complexity that I can't tell it's a completely hollow shell inside there. And I suppose if you really think about it, a lot of trees are that way. The leaves do tend to be kind of on the outside, and the inside is more branches. So maybe you could fill in that inside with branches. In my case, there are actually not a lot of branches. It's just a few down there. We'll talk about the trunk and the branches here in a second. But if I wanted to do that more properly, I would probably fill the branches up throughout this tree. So between the solidify and the displace, that gives you the geometry of the tree. But what about the actual texture on here? Because if you look at this in a non-textured mode, this is what it looks like, which is reasonably okay, for a very cartoony tree. But if you want a slightly more realistic-looking tree, especially when you look at it in a rendered mode with shadows like this, then you need a little bit extra, and that's where the texturing comes in. So let's look at the leaf texture here. So I've got this thing called vertcol foliage, and so what that means is if I do vertex coloring on this, or vertex painting on this, and change the color of this geometry, then the color of the shader will also change. And so, for example, let's say I wanted this tree to be like a bright kind of hot pink or something like that, right? Well, then I could grab this and shade it, and now I get a hot pink tree. And actually that kind of looks cool. It looks a bit like cherry blossoms. So I might actually do that on a couple trees here in a bit, but for now I'm just showing you what's up. So right, you can change the colors if you want, or you can make just very pointed little changes, like maybe you want a little bit of hot pink here and there, right? Let's undo all that. Or whatever you want. You can make it a little more shaded at the bottom, a little more light colored at the top if you wanted to, sort of bake your lighting or whatever you want to do like that. You do in the vertex colors, and the vertex colors are then read out by the shader using this vertex color node, which I plug into the subsurface color and into this overlay node here, which is going to get this other stuff. And this other stuff is just the textures of the leaves. And so let's take a look at what the textures of the leaves look like. So what I want to do there is two things. First of all, I have this gradient texture, quadratic sphere. I rotate that a bit, so what ends up happening with this thing is that I have, it's dark at the bottom, light at the top, right? And so the the reason for that is I want to actually have the leaves at the bottom be somewhat larger than the leaves at the top. So if you look here, the leaves at the top are small, leaves at the bottom are large. The way I achieve that is via this gradient texture. The gradient texture goes into a brightness contrast and then goes into the scale of these two Voronoi nodes. Okay, so I need to change the brightness and contrast because by default, the gradient texture is just going from 0 to 1. And I don't want the scale to go from 0 to 1. I want the scale to go from something quite a lot larger. So if I change the brightness, you'll notice if I take this brightness from 25 and make it smaller, the leaves get much larger on the tree. If I make the brightness much larger, then the leaves get much smaller on the tree. And the contrast, similarly, is deciding how stark that difference is. So if I make the contrast very high, then you get big leaves that very quickly turn into small leaves. If you make the contrast quite low, then it's very difficult to tell the difference between the large leaves and the small ones. So you want that somewhere. I make the brightness and contrast exactly the same, both 25. But play around with those values to make the leaves better to your liking. The next thing is I have this texture coordinate node is going into two mapping nodes, each of which are type vector. It's very important you make these type vector instead of the default, which I believe is type point. If you make them type point, then the leaves at the top will start to spiral around or squish up a bit and get a bit ugly. But if you make them type vector, you get this beautiful, nice, undistorted leaves all over the tree. Very important. Object info node, I don't use, deleting that. These two Voronoi textures go into color ramps, and so the reason we want that is so that we can decide if we want these leaves to look like leaves or if they want to be more like just kind of shading. So, if you pull down the color ramp, you can get something like this, which to me looks more like kind of pods hanging off, and as you pull this up, it kind of flattens that out and makes it more like leaves. This other Voronoi texture is just to break the larger patterns up here. So I guess it's about the same. Right. I see. Right. I had originally set up these two to be different sizes, and so you would have kind of a large scale, how would you call it, texture variation through the tree. But instead I decided what I wanted was that each leaf would have a little dark outline. And so that's what's going on here now, is if I want the dark outline to be more, I pull this back. If I want the dark outline to be less, I pull it forward here. That way you can kind of give the leaves a little bit more of a 3D shape. I would probably should offset this at some point, like maybe offset it down so that it looks like there's shadows coming from the top. But for now, every leaf has just its own outline. And so this lets you decide how stark you want that outline to be. And also you can kind of thin the tree out using these same things. Like if I make the outline quite small, well, now you can actually see through the tree much better. And if I pull it all the way here, you can't. It's also more dark on the inside. I believe the same thing will happen with the right side of the slider on this one. Yeah, you can sort of thin these out by putting these sliders really close together like this and a bit further to the left. Anyway, the two Voronoi textures going into these two color ramps, these two kind of press closer together, these a bit further apart, just both go into this linear light mix RGB here. That one, I mix them with a factor of 1. You can also, again, play with that if you maybe want to have a little bit less of that stark outline on there, a little bit more. Actually, to me, now that I'm looking at this, I like this a little bit more to the left. That kind of looks better to me. I suppose also you'd want to look and see, like, well, yeah, but how does it look like in the rendered scene? Do I like it like that, or do I want to pull it back to all the way over here? It's very difficult to tell the difference between those two. Okay, there it's more muted colors. Here it's more solid colors. Yeah, so I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that. And let's get the trunk back in here. There we go. And let's click the tree again so we can see what we're doing with the shader. Right. So then I take all that, this is all the kind of leaf patterns, all that bit here, and I plug it into an overlay mix RGB with the original vertex colors. So between those two things, that goes into the base color. So that's the base color of the tree. That way we get the leaves and their coloring on the base color. Then I also just throw in some subsurface on here. As you can see, it's just a straight principled RGB or principled BSDF. And the principled BSDF, I dial up the subsurface max here, and then plug that vertex coloring into that. And then most of these, I believe, are left as defaults, but I'll make it big enough here that you can kind of see what the values are, and if you're not getting what the look I have here, you can feel free to dial in these same settings. I definitely changed the transmission. Transmission just lets you see kind of the colors behind the tree, and I do kind of like the look of that when I'm in the kind of viewing everything here. So if there's green behind the trees are a bit more green. If there's blue behind the trees are a bit more blue, and that's kind of what that transmission gives you there. All right, let's look at one tree again. The final thing is I wanted to have a little bit of texturing here. So we've broken up the profile of the tree by using this the displacement and solidify modifiers. I guess solidify not so much as displacement. That breaks up the profile here. But we also, if we don't plug something into the normal, then the textures here look a bit flat. And so I wanted to get a bit more of a 3D look there. So I just take the same color ramp, or how would you say, the leaf texture, I suppose, plug it into this bump node, and then plug that into the normal of the BSDF, and then that gives you more of a kind of textured look here, especially if there's light shining on it, a stark light shining on one side. It'll give it a very good sort of 3D look there. You can kind of see that here. You've got a little rim light hitting it from the left here, and that gives you that kind of look in the middle there, like that you've got some texturing going, and it doesn't hurt any that you really do have some 3D going on here. So that between those two effects, you get a reasonable look here. The bump node, I'm giving it a strength 0.5, distance 1, height is what's getting that. So that's everything for the leaves of the tree. That's how that all is working. So the trunk of the tree is a little bit simpler, but the same basic concept. I'm just going to take some a gradient texture object, plug it into a mapping node, plug that into noise texture, plug that into a linear light of the vertex coloring, which plugs into the base color. The vertex colors themselves go into subsurface. Subsurface I don't have dialed up as much much on the trunk as I did in the leaves. And the leaves it's maxed here is like 0.25. But then again, also I plug this into a bump node that goes into the normal. So let's make that 0.4. I like to see nice even numbers. That was basically the same. You could just kind of copy these values if you would like to have something that's the same as mine. But that's just for the texture and the coloring. Of course, you do vertex colors. I took some vertex colors and painted on here, made it a nice set of brown colors. The other bit is if I move the trunk, I also want the trunk to change shape a bit between from tree to tree. Now the trunk is going to be a bit, or I should say the branches are a bit too regular. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 branches going up into the tree. So it's kind of obvious that this is being copied from tree to tree. But if you're able to make the trunks or the trunks and the branches a bit more generic looking, then I've done the same thing as the leaves. I've added a displacement modifier, and I use the exact same displacement texture as the leaves. Like in theory, I should probably have 2 different ones. For now, I'm lazy and haven't set that up. But that means that because I'm doing the same thing with the global coordinates on the tree displacement texture here, like that's the same, as you can see, the same one as before, right? Then what ends up happening is as I move the trunk, it changes its shape. You can see, for example, watch this part right here. As I move this, it goes into different shapes. It kind of helps break the profile up a bit. So even though people can tell it's the same, let's say the same trunk and the same branches, it looks like slightly different trees in each time. So that's kind of the way you get that going. You probably really need to model like 4 or 5 different tree trunks, and then you can like have different ones going up into the trees and get something a little more broken up. As it is, like when we look through here, you can probably notice that all these tree trunks are the exact same thing. They're not actually the exact same thing. I did model them slightly differently, change the stuff, but largely they're the same. They're skinny here, they're fat at the bottom, fat at the top, etc. So that said, you get the variation with the displacement modifier. There we go. Well, let's zoom this out a little bit. I don't think there's really anything else to say about the tree trunk. It's much simpler than the leaves, as you can see. And then I guess the next step is modeling up like 4 or 5 trees and then grouping them together into a collection. So that's what I've done up here. It's underneath ground. Here we go, trees group collection, right? So if I unhide that collection is here. It's these trees that are kind of floating above the ground here. So this is a collection of, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 trees of different like size and shape and a bit random placed. So then once you put those in a collection and then hide that collection, say you wanted to add a group of those trees over like here, right? You can place your 3D cursor there and then do add collection instance, and you want the trees group collection here. And then that instance is placed here. You get into the ground, so I need to rotate them a bit, and then maybe I want to scale this up or something like that. And now I have that collection of trees over there in the hills. And so what I've got is that same collection of trees. Like I've got 3 of them placed here. I've got a few of them placed over on this hilltop over here. And so it just gives you a nice set of trees that you can look at in various places. And because the trees are, once you place the group of trees, you can also like scale it up or scale it down or rotate it, or I might scale it up like this and then scale it on all but a z-axis and make them like short and fat. You can really give them a different sort of look and break them up and keep them from being too obvious that that's just duplicates over and over and over. So this gives what I think are pretty nice looking trees. So good luck making your own trees. Thanks for watching.